Welcome to your last online lecture of the course. We're going to talk about international strategy today. It's the one of the last strategies we want to look at. So recall we've talked about business strategy, we've talked about corporate strategy, and now we're going to focus on international strategy. And again, keeping in mind that everything needs to be tied back to those opportunities and threats coming at you from the external environment. So let's talk about the global or international strategy. The global marketplace is out there. It's real. There's really no escaping it at this point. There is an opportunity out there to increase your market share and do things more cost effectively. However, there are a lot of risks when you diversify abroad that have to be taken into account. We all are familiar with the term globalization. It's the real thing. There's nothing you can do about it at this point. The internet has changed how fast things go. It has greatly expanded, along with wireless and all high-speed communications, just the amount of international exchanges that take place. And so there's obviously a huge opportunity out there, huge target market. It's also important to remember that globalization wasn't just about U.S. companies exploiting global markets, but also it's about global companies coming to the U.S. And so when you look at competitive environments, for example, obviously the competitive rivalry in the Porter's Five Forces is made much more intense by the fact of having all of these companies out there trying to get into the U.S. markets. So when you start to evaluate the kinds of companies or the kinds of countries that you might want to go to, there are things to look at. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Our friend Michael Porter has the Diamond of National Advantage, really talking about different countries, how you rank them, so to speak. Factor endowments are things like labor and natural resources, what's out there, what's available. Demand conditions really involve the latent market demand in those countries, related industries, supporting industries, and then the companies in that country that might be competing with you. So this really is all about how do I evaluate a country or a region, if you will, as a potential location to expand globally. India is a classic example. They have made themselves into a software development giant, and it's been done purposely with huge subsidies and encouragement going to the public and private schools, lots of skilled workers, their tax policies support it, and they also have a growing middle class which demands high-tech products. So why do you expand internationally? Why do companies actually look at going global? The first one is we want to take advantage of trying to increase our target market, our size of potential markets. Obviously, the global market is huge, and it's something that we want to take a look at as a potential for growth. Secondly, and we're going to talk a lot about this, is that it gives you the advantage of looking at doing things more cost effectively at every step in your value chain. Are there opportunities out there for you to be more efficient and effective by effectively doing things overseas rather than at home? And this is really what we'll focus on here, is that every function in your value chain, one could evaluate whether to move it offshore or not. And those are the two areas that I'm going to focus on the most. One is it a good target market? Does it expand your market? Is it an opportunity to grow revenue? And secondly, is there an opportunity in all of the functions of your value chain to be more cost effective and more and optimize that value chain to make it the most valuable that it can be? Obviously, when you go overseas, you start to see a lot of political risk, a lot of economic risk due to piracy and counterfeiting. In this day and age, with terrorism afoot and so many disruptions, one has to be very cautious about where one goes. Another issue internationally is, of course, the management risk. When you start to look at different cultures and customs and languages, the amount of the opportunity to make mistakes based on lack of understanding of other people and other people's cultures is really quite large. And if you're trying to do a partnership or joint venture, the ability to work with other countries' cultures becomes paramount. One of the ways to manage risk is to disperse your value chain. In other words, spread it over several countries rather than one, so that you're not beholden to a single location for whatever it is that you're outsourcing. That's one option for managing the sort of political risk that's possible. Offshoring can be expensive, but you are hopefully able to save money from lower wages and benefits and all energy and regulatory costs. But you also have to be careful as those things start to increase. You may need more inventory. There may be costs of coordination and costs of protecting intellectual property. You know, it's interesting. In China, for example, for years they were considered the low-cost provider, and because their labor was so cheap. And what's happened over time is, as the political risk has increased, the cost of transportation has increased, and labor costs have increased significantly. The desire to relocate some of the factories that have gone to China has developed because it's actually becoming more cost competitive in some cases to bring those factories back to the United States when you add up all the costs and then throw in the uncertainty. So the decision to move manufacturing or other functions offshore or to other countries has become more complicated, or at least harder to justify than it used to be. So when we look at strategies for the global marketplace, we want to look at two opposing pressures. Basically, the first is the cost reduction, and the second is adaptation to local markets. And so basically what we want to talk about are and we're gonna build a typical matrix, if you will, for looking at the international strategies. And basically, along the one axis, the bottom axis, is the ability or the desire to adapt your product to the local market, and along the other axis will be the desire to optimize your value chain. And what the desire to adapt your product has to do with is that if you have a standardized product, one that is the same product all over the world, it may lower your overall cost because you're only making one product for every single market in the world. It will spread your investment over a larger market. However, it also assumes that all those people out there globally want the same thing. Apple, for example, is a good example of this. They make an iPhone, and it is the same iPhone regardless of whether they sell it. That has actually cost them significant market share in countries where people might desire a less expensive phone. One size fits all does not generally apply. And so, but on the one hand, we're going to talk about the desire to, on the bottom axis here, to adapt your product to the local market. So there's 4 different types of strategies we're going to talk about: international strategy, multi-domestic, global, and transnational. So international strategy basically says that we're going to do what we do. In other words, we're not going to adapt our product to the local market. We're not going to offshore. We're not going to optimize our value chain in the global environment. Basically what that says is we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and if we happen to get some international orders, that'd be great. There are some strengths to this. Obviously, there's some cost benefits because you don't have to adapt your product or make different product lines, if you will, to suit the global market. It also is limited because you actually don't take advantage of new ideas or innovations that may actually occur in those local markets. And if you don't adapt your product to the local market, you could lose share. When I was at Raven, just to use them as an example, this is what we did. Whatever products we built were tailored to the U.S. market. And when we would get orders, we would from Canada or Brazil or Europe, we would service them. But we didn't adapt our product. We didn't change our product. We didn't have anything going on internationally in terms of any of the functions in our value chain. And so we were very clearly, I'll say, stuck in that bottom left box, the international strategy. So a global strategy infers that a firm wants to lower its overall operating costs or optimize its value chain. You still have everything from a product standpoint is still standardized, but now and operations are still centralized in the sense that management, everything is controlled from a local headquarters, if you will. But the idea is to optimize your value chain by moving functions to countries where those functions can be better taken advantage of or better optimized, their costs lowered. Apple, again, isn't a good example of a global strategy with regards to the iPhone in that regard, because the manufacturing of the iPhone mostly is done in China. And so that function was moved overseas, even though the management and the oversight and the strategy was all handled, tightly handled and controlled in the U.S. Again, this has the limitations of you're not adapting to the local markets. Depending on how you do your offshoring, if you will, you may increase dependence on single facilities, and that can lead to higher tariff and transportation costs. Having uniform standards worldwide is a good thing potentially, and also gives you some economies of scale. So that's the upper left-hand quadrant. If you look now at the multi-domestic strategy, a multi-domestic strategy puts emphasis on differentiating products and services to adapt to the local market. Products and services are tailored to local use, including language, culture, customer preferences, and distribution systems. Markets can be expanded, and decisions are generally decentralized. In other words, the marketing and sales, if you will, has often decentralized, and you're giving up a lot of power, if you will, or decision making into the local market. Obviously, the strengths involve the ability to adapt those products, and also gives you the ability to adapt to unique markets and niches. However, it does allow you, or it does make it harder to realize cost savings through economies of scale. Again, using Raven as an example, when I was there, we pushed hard to get into the global market. We did not have a global strategy. We had a multi-domestic strategy. And what happened, as just as sure as you could see, is as soon as we started selling products in Europe, for example, it became clear that we needed to, simple things. We needed to um, write our manuals in different languages. Same thing in Brazil. We needed manuals in Portuguese. That's local adaptation. Then we needed to make our cable sets and all of our electronics more compatible with the local market. So we started down the path, and we would set up companies, marketing arms and customer service arms in these countries to take care of the products that we sold there. And so you had basically a multi-domestic strategy, everything controlled from the US or manufactured, but the marketing and sales was located overseas, and we started to adapt our products to the local market. And finally, transnational strategy basically combines both. You're trying to optimize your functions, and also you're trying to optimize your functions, lower your costs, and adapt to the local market. Um, Obviously, this becomes more complex and harder to manage, but it does give you the ability, if you do it right, to lower your overall costs and to get into way more markets. Now, another thing to be thinking about is that when you do go global, going global is sort of a misnomer. You don't have to go global all at once. You can pick a particular country to go to. You can pick a particular region. For small U.S. companies that are trying to dip their toe into the global market, so to speak, you might try Canada or the UK or Australia. Why? Because they're the most like we are of the markets out there. Mexico maybe is another one because it's close, or or Europe because their democracies are more like us in a way. It just, you want to keep your risk down when you're first starting into the global environment. There also are different ways to get into the international market. You don't have to form a company. There are different levels as you go up. Exporting, which is just what it is. It's you don't set up companies, you don't do joint ventures, all that stuff. You simply export your product overseas. Licensing is another example where you basically license somebody to make and sell your product. Franchising, global franchising, strategic alliances. So kind of like we talked about with corporate strategy, there are a lot of different ways to get into the global market that don't necessarily involve spending a ton of money and forming companies or joint ventures or wholly owned subsidiaries or brand new entities. There's often a lot of benefit to be had simply by going slow. And so the main point of all this is that one, there's two sort of things that drive global expansion. One is optimizing your functions in order to lower costs and operate more efficiently by doing things overseas. And secondly, by getting into new markets so that you increase the size of your market or target market by tapping global markets. Now, and then the second piece that's very important is also, how do you do it? Do you do it through exporting, licensing, franchising, etc.? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about just a little bit, and I'm not going to go through all these charts, but the fourth strategy is sort of, I call it corporate entrepreneurship. And this is basically, when I think about it, is the ability for a company to innovate. And the idea here is that anytime you talk about a merger or acquisition, or you talk about a new product development or anything like that, you always can either make it or buy it. And the question will become, is it better to merge with somebody or acquire a technology or buy it? Is it better to build our own marketing department in Mexico, or is it better to partner with somebody who's already there? And so it's going to be, and it's also important to remember that when we talk about corporate entrepreneurship, really what everybody wants to talk about is new product development and new designs and new technologies, and you associate that with a differentiation strategy. And again, you can think about this as the make of the make or buy decision of, okay, we need a new product line. Do we make it ourselves or buy it? But it's important to remember that it also applies to processes, organizational processes. Every one of your functions can innovate. And I know people look at me like I'm crazy, but your accounting department can innovate. They have the ability, for instance, to figure out how to get the financials out quicker, or how to procure a little more efficiently, or how to come up with new metrics that measure things a little more accurately. And people think, well, that's just silly, but every innovation like that makes the company more efficient, makes a weakness more of a strength, or makes a strength even stronger. And so I'd encourage you to think about, as you're looking at your strategic recommendations, innovation within a group, within a function, can be quite important. We look at significant radical innovation, which usually takes a long time, and we look at incremental innovation, which is more of an evolutionary kind of approach. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'll let you take a look at the chapters and go through these charts if you want. But there are different ways of implementing corporate entrepreneurship. Some companies have new venture organizations where they actually put people from different organizations, they put them into a single separate group that generates new ventures. Actually, when I was younger, I worked for the Hughes Aircraft in something called their New Venture organization. And it was that organization that gave birth to both DirecTV and XM Radio. And so they basically had a bunch of people separated from the main organization whose job it was to do new ventures. Business incubators, either internal or external, where people get together and can foment ideas and mentor new ideas. 3M has an internal venture capital group that basically but has a program where if you're an engineer and you create a new product, you can get it internally funded and have the opportunity to build that into an industry. And so we want to take a look at how you're going to, if one of your strategic recommendations, for instance, is to say, we need to do more innovation, how are you going to do that? Do you use new venture groups? Do you use business incubators? How do you go about it? So that's and some of these charts talk about entrepreneurial culture, the need for product champions. And one thing that I'm always very interested in, as you know, is measuring success. How do you know whether a new venture has succeeded or not? And so you want to set up some metrics for that. And so the main point here is that, again, when you think about your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, you've thought about corporate strategy and product diversification and mergers and acquisitions. Theoretically, you've thought about international strategy in terms of increasing our target market by going overseas, or reducing our costs by managing our functions. Corporate entrepreneurship is a way to do those things as well. Can I come up with a new product? Can I innovate it myself? Or should I buy it? Or merge with it, or strategically partner with it? If I'm going to go international, should I do it myself and do it as an entrepreneurial venture, or do I buy an established business? If I'm doing it, if I need to improve my marketing function, is there a way for me to do that using corporate entrepreneurship internally, or do I need to go acquire the right assets? So that's again, I call it the make or buy decision, but it gives you yet another tool in the toolbox to deal with the opportunities and threats and to overcome your weaknesses and enhance your strengths.